Letter 5, The Pope, Part 2. Before proceeding to the question of the way in which the 5 wounds of the will are produced, and what the concrete practical method of the magic of the pentagram of 5 wounds is, it is necessary rather that we ponder on the concept itself of wound. A wound is a door through which the objective exterior world intrudes into the interior of the closed system of the subjective interior world. Speaking biologically, it is a breach in the walls of the fortress of the organism by which forces from outside the organism penetrate into its interior. A simple lesion of the skin, for example, signifies such a breach, and for a certain time gives the air, and all that which is borne by the air, access into an interior region of the organism which would be barred to it if the skin were intact. Now, the organ of sight, the eye, in comparison with the surface of the human body covered over with skin, is a wound which can be covered by mobile skin, the eyelids. Through this wound, the objective outer world penetrates into our inner life with that much greater intensity corresponding to the degree that sight reveals more of the outer world than the sense of touch. With the eyelids closed, the place where the experience of the world named sight takes place becomes again that reduced experience of the world, yet normal for the entire surface of the body, that we designate as touch. The eyes are open wounds which are so sensitive that they suffer with, i.e. react to, every nuance of light and colour. And it is the same with the other sense organs. They are wounds, i.e. it is they which impose on us the objective reality of the outer world. There where I would like to see beautiful flowers, my eyes make me see a pile of dung. I am forced to see what the objective world shows me by way of my eyes. It is like a nail from outside nailing my will. The senses, given that they are sound and functioning normally, are wounds through which the objective world, without regard to our will, imposes itself on us. But the senses are organs of perception, not of action. Imagine that the 5 organs of action, the limbs, including the head in its function as a limb, were to have analogous wounds, i.e. that the 5 currents of will of which they are an expression were to give access to an objective will which would be to personal desires what sense perceptions are to the play of fantasy. This is the esoteric concept of the wound, and this concept can become a spiritual reality, then psychic, and eventually even physical with some people. The stigmatics, from St. Francis of Assisi to Padre Pio in Italy and Teresa Neumann in Germany during the present epoch, are people for whom the reality of the 5 wounds has reached to the physical plane. These are the future organs of the will in formation, the organs of action which taken together have the sacred pentagram as their sign, the quinternary united and bound to the fullness of the decad, according to St. Martin. It is still necessary to specify the 5 wounds corresponding to the 5 dark currents of the will, the desire for personal greatness, to take, to keep, to advance and to hold on to at the expense of others, which correspond in their turn to the 5 limbs, including the head as a limb, although only 4 are allocated to the corresponding limbs. The desire to take or get hold of things is bound to the right hand. Similarly, the desire to retain or keep things belongs to the left hand. Likewise, the desire to advance at the expense of others and the desire to hold on to at the expense of others correspond to the right foot and the left foot respectively. But it is not the case concerning the desire for personal greatness that it corresponds to the head. The head does not bear the 5th wound, for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it bears the crown of thorns, which is borne in principle by every person capable of objective thought, the crown of thorns being given to the human being since the beginning of human history. It is that subtle organ which is designated for us in the Occident as the 8-petaled lotus, and which is designated in India as the 1,000-petaled lotus, or Sahasrara, crown center. This crown center is a natural gift, as it were, to each human being, and every normal person possesses it. The thorns of the crown center function as the nails of objectivity, which give conscience to thought. It is thanks to them that thought has not become wholly emancipated and as arbitrary, for example, as the imagination is. Thought as such is, in spite of all, the organ of truth, not of illusion. Thus it is not thought as such which allows the desire for personal greatness or the tendency towards megalomania, but rather the will which makes use of the head and which can take hold of thought and reduce it to the role of its instrument. And this constitutes the second reason as to why the fifth wound, that of organic humility, replacing the current of the will to greatness, is not found in the head, but rather in the heart, i.e. it reaches the heart, penetrating from the right-hand side. Because it is there that the will to greatness has its origin, and it is there from whence it takes hold of the head and makes it its instrument. This is why many thinkers and scientists want to think without the heart in order to be objective, which is an illusion, because one can in no way think without the heart being the activating principle of thought. What one can do is to think with a humble and warm heart instead of with a pretentious and cold heart. Thus, the fifth wound, which is the first insofar as its importance is concerned, is that of the heart instead of the head being, from the point of view of the active will, an instrument or limb of the heart. Let us now turn to the question concerning the origin of the five wounds, i.e. how they are produced, and to the concrete practical method of the magic of the sacred pentagram of 5 wounds. How does one acquire the 5 wounds? There exists only one single method, one sole means leading to this. And, no matter whether in full knowledge or whether instinctively, every esotericist, every mystic, every idealist, every spiritual seeker, and lastly every man of goodwill makes use of it, in Europe as in Asia, today as 20 centuries ago. This universal method of all ages and all cultures is nothing other than the practice of the 3 traditional vows, namely obedience, poverty, and chastity. Obedience rivets the will to greatness of the heart. Poverty holds fast the desire to take and the desire to keep of the right hand and the left hand. Chastity pins down the desires of the Nimrodic hunter to advance and to hold on to at the expense of others, or in other words to hunt and to trap game, of the right foot and the left foot. The vow of obedience is the practice of silencing personal desires, emotions and imagination in the face of reason and conscience. It is the primacy of the ideal as opposed to the apparent, the nation as opposed to the personal, humanity as opposed to the nation, and God as opposed to humanity. It is the life of cosmic and human hierarchical ordering. It is the meaning and justification of the fact that there are seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, angels, priests, knights, and commoners. Obedience is order, it is international law, it is the state, it is the church, it is universal peace. True obedience is the very opposite of tyranny and slavery, since its root is the love which issues from faith and confidence. That which is above serves that which is below, and that which is below obeys that which is above. Obedience is the practical conclusion to that which one recognizes as the existence of something higher than oneself. Whosoever recognizes God obeys. Such obedience as is practiced in religious orders and the Catholic spiritual knighthood is a form of training, moreover very effective, of the will, with a view to riveting the will to greatness. The obedience that the Chela has to his guru in India and Tibet follows in principle the same aim. This is true also of the absolute obedience that the Hasidim have towards their tzadkim in the Jewish Hasidic communities, and similarly it is so with the obedience without reserve on the part of the disciples of the Startsi spiritual masters in Orthodox pre-Bolshevist Russia. The universal formula of obedience is fiat voluntas tua. The vow of poverty is the practice of inner emptiness, which is established as a consequence of the silence of personal desires, emotions and imagination, so that the soul is capable of receiving from above the revelation of the Word, the life and the light. Poverty is perpetual active vigil and expectation before the eternal sources of creativity. It is the soul awaiting that which is new and unexpected. It is the aptitude for learning always and everywhere. It is the conditio sine qua non of all illumination, all revelation, and all initiation. The following is a short story which makes evident in a wonderful way the practical spiritual meaning of poverty. Once upon a time, 4 brothers went on a journey in order to seek the greatest treasure. After a week of travelling, they arrived at a mountain of iron ore. "A whole mountain of iron ore," cried one of the 4. "Here is the treasure we have been seeking." But the 3 others said, "This is not the greatest treasure," and continued their walk, whilst the brother remained by the mountain of iron ore. He was now rich, and they were as poor as before. 1 month later they arrived at a field strewn with greenish and yellow stones. "This is copper," cried one of the 3 brothers. "This is certainly the treasure that we are seeking." But the 2 other brothers did not share his opinion. Thus he remained there, being the rich proprietor of a copper mine, while the 2 others continued on their way as poor as they were before. After a year they arrived at a valley full of stones shining with a whitish light. "Silver," cried one of the brothers. "This is at last the treasure that we are seeking." But the other brother shook his head and continued on his way, whilst his brother remained there as the rich proprietor of a silver mine. 7 years later he arrived at a stony place in an arid desert. He sat down, being half dead with fatigue. It was then that he noticed that the pebbles under his feet were gleaming. It was gold. The vow of chastity means to say the putting into practice of the resolution to live according to solar law, without covetousness and without indifference, because virtue is boring and vice is disgusting. But that which lives at the foundation of the heart is neither boring nor disgusting. The foundation of the heart is love. The heart lives only when it loves. It is then like the sun. And chastity is the state of the human being in which the heart, having become solar, is the centre of gravity. In other words, chastity is the state of the human being where the centre named in Occidental esotericism as the 12-petaled lotus, Amahata in Indian esotericism, is awakened and becomes the sun of the microcosmic planetary system. The 3 lotus centres situated below it, the 10-petaled, the 6-petaled, and the 4-petaled, begin then to function in conformity with the life of the heart, the 12-petaled lotus, i.e. according to solar law. When they do this, the person is chaste, no matter whether he or she is celibate or married. Thus there are virgins who are married and mothers of children, and there are physical virgins who are not so in reality. The ideal of the Virgin Mother that the traditional Church, Catholic and Orthodox, puts forward is truly worthy of reverence. It is the ideal of chastity which triumphs over sterility and indifference. The practice of chastity does not concern solely the domain of sex. It bears equally on all other domains where there is a choice between solar law and all sorts of dulling intoxications. Thus, for example, all fanaticism sins against chastity, because there is one carried away by a dark current. The French Revolution was an orgy of perverse collective intoxication, just as the revolution in Russia was. Nationalism, such as in the Germany of Hitler, is likewise a form of intoxication drowning the conscience of the heart, and is therefore incompatible with the ideal of chastity. There are also forms of practical occultism which lend themselves to the pursuit of an unhealthy intoxication. Thus, as Josephine Pelladin acknowledged, "I do not conceal it. We have all at first been seduced by the aesthetic of occultism, and infatuated with the quaint and the strange. One has subscribed to the amusements of nervous females. One has sought thrills, the thrill of the invisible and of the beyond. One has asked for the excitement of the incorporeal." Josephine Pelladin, L'Occult Catholique, page 309. The practice of chastity holds fast the leanings of the hunter in the human being, of which the male side is inclined to pursue game and the female side to set traps. The practice of poverty binds the tendencies of the thief in the human being, where the male side is inclined to seize and the female side to keep indefinitely, instead of waiting for the free gift or the merited fruit of work. The practice of obedience, lastly, rivets the will to greatness or the inclinations of the usurper in human nature, whose male side is inclined to estimate itself great in its own eyes, and whose female side seeks to make itself estimated so in the eyes of others. These 3 vows therefore constitute the sole known and indispensable method which leads to the 5 wounds, i.e. to the effective pentagram of sacred magic. It is still necessary to specify that it is not a matter of the virtues of humility, poverty, and chastity being wholly realized, because no man in the flesh can possess these virtues totally, but rather of their practice, i.e. sincere efforts aimed at their realization. It is the effort which counts. Such is the answer to the question, how does one acquire the 5 wounds? Now follows the response to the question, how does the magic of the sacred pentagram of the 5 wounds operate? As we have indicated above, it is the purity of the will and not its force which constitutes the basis of the magic of the sacred pentagram of the 5 wounds. In this it corresponds to divine magic, which does not force but establishes or re-establishes freedom of choice through the presence of the true, the beautiful, and the good. Now it is a matter in the magic of the sacred pentagram of 5 wounds of accomplishing the living presence of the good alongside the consciousness of the subject of the operation. For good does not fight evil, it does not struggle against it. The good is only present or it is not. Its victory consists in that it results in being present, its defeat in that it is forced to be absent. And it is the 5 wounds which assure the presence of the good, i.e. the presence of pure will from above. The following is an episode which is found in the Considerations on the Stigmata of St. Francis, 5th consideration, and which is well suited to serve as a key to the problem with which we are occupied. A Franciscan friar prayed for 8 years, following the death of St. Francis, that the secret words which the seraphim had spoken to St. Francis when he gave him the stigmata would be revealed to him. Now one day St. Francis appeared to him and to 7 other friars, and, turning towards this friar, spoke to him thus: Know, dearest friar, that when I was on Mount Alverna, all wrapped in the contemplation of the Passion of Christ, in this seraphic vision I was by Christ thus stigmatized in my body, and then Christ said to me, Knowest thou what I have done to thee? I have given thee the marks of my passion in order that thou mayest be my standard bearer. And even as I, on the day of my death, descended into limbo and drew thence all the souls I found therein by virtue of my stigmatas, and led them up to paradise, so do I grant to thee from this hour that thou mayest be conformed to me in thy death as thou hast been in thy life, that after thou hast passed from this life thou shalt go every year on the day of thy death to purgatory, and shalt deliver all the souls thou shalt find there of thy 3 orders, to wit, minors, sisters, and penitents, and likewise the souls of thy devoted followers, and this in virtue of thy stigmatas that I have given thee, and thou shalt lead them to paradise. And those words I told not while I lived in the world. Considerations on the glorious stigmata of St. Francis in the Little Flowers of St. Francis, Book 2, Chapter 9. This said, St. Francis suddenly disappeared. Numerous friars subsequently heard this narrative from the lips of the 8 friars who were present at this vision and the revelation of St. Francis. And Brother Jacobus Blancus, Lector Romanus, proclaimed this and said that he had heard it from one of the above 8, adds the manuscript of St. Isidore, discussed by Paul Sabatier at the end of the narrative. Let us now analyze the narrative from the point of view of the magic of the sacred pentagram of the 5 wounds. It may be noted first of all that the stigmata given to St. Francis are of a spiritual as well as a corporeal nature, for their virtue, i.e. their magical power, continues after his death. Also here it is indicated that the virtue of the stigmata of St. Francis, as well as those of Christ himself, is revealed in that he is able to lead back souls from limbo and purgatory and conduct them to paradise. Let us mention lastly that the narrative is quite categorical concerning the statement that it is only by virtue of his stigmata that Jesus Christ, prior to his resurrection, led souls out of limbo and conducted them to paradise. And similarly, it is only by virtue of his stigmata that St. Francis also withdraws from purgatory each year on the day of his death all souls who are bound to him by a spiritual tie and leads them to paradise. Take the terms limbo, purgatory, and paradise in their meaning as understood by analogy, and you have a clear and precise formula for the working of the magic of the sacred pentagram of 5 wounds. It effects a change from the natural state, limbo, and from the state of human suffering, purgatory, to that of the blessedness of the divine state, paradise. The operation of the magic of the sacred pentagram of 5 wounds therefore consists in transforming the natural state into the human state, and this latter into the divine state. This is the work of spiritual alchemy of the transformation from nature, limbo, and from the human, purgatory, into the divine, paradise, according to the traditional threefold division: nature, man, and God. Let us now consider more closely the practical meaning of the terms limbo, purgatory, and paradise, insofar as they are stages in the work of transmutation, or liberation, of the magic of the sacred pentagram of 5 wounds. Their practical meaning is not spatial, i.e. referring to places, but refers rather to states of the human being, in body, soul, and spirit. When we understand it thus, we shall readily discover that the 3 states are known to us through experience, and that experience supplies us with the keys of analogy to be able to understand the ideas of limbo, purgatory, and paradise as such, i.e. on all planes and at every level, psychological, metaphysical, and theological, of their application. Each of us has had the experience of a harmonious state of good health accompanied by a carefree state of soul and calmness of spirit. It is what one calls joie de vivre, pure and simple. If there were no serious illnesses, sorrows, and problems, this would be permanently our natural state. It is what nature, insofar as it is virgin and unfallen, offers us, which we could enjoy constantly if there were no fallen elements in nature, no sickness and sin, no sorrow, fear, and remorse in ourselves, and if, above all, life as a whole was not the field which death reaps unceasingly. But we have nevertheless, from time to time, moments, hours, perhaps even whole days, of the experience of the natural joie de vivre, without sorrows or cares. And this experience supplies us with the key of analogy for understanding what the meaning of limbo is. Limbo is the natural state of physical and psychic health that nature, outside and within ourselves, can offer us from itself without the assistance of supernatural or divine grace. Limbo is the virginal part of nature, human nature and outer nature, according to the traditional doctrine natura vulnerata non delita, nature is wounded but not destroyed. Those who know the Bhagavad Gita, or who have occupied themselves at all with the Hindu tradition, will easily recognize in the state designated by the term limbo the state of guna or nature, prakriti, that is called sattva in India, the other 2 gunas being tamas and rajas. Concerning the experience relating to purgatory, it comprises all purging, suffering, physical, psychic, and spiritual. It is corporeal, moral, and intellectual suffering, which is our immediate state between the experience of the natural innocence of limbo and the moments of heavenly joy when the rays of paradise reach us. We already experience here below a foretaste of purgatory and of paradise. We suffer and the consolations of heaven are given us. Human life is natural, innocent joy, and its ruin is through sin. What ensues is suffering, and it is the rays of benediction from heaven which console us. This is our life. It consists of experiencing the reality of limbo, purgatory, and paradise. Now, the magic of the sacred pentagram of 5 wounds leads souls out of limbo and purgatory and conducts them to paradise. This means to say that it makes heaven present in limbo and purgatory, that it enables it to descend into the domain of innocent and suffering nature. This, in turn, means to say that it introduces the supernatural into the natural, heals sickness, illumines consciousness, and enables participation in the spiritual life. Purgatory includes all sickness and all suffering. To be led out of it signifies liberation from it, i.e., to be healed, illumined, and reunited with the Spirit. The magic of the 5 wounds operates by the presence of the reality of the superhuman spiritual world by means of the wounds, and accomplishes the transmutation from the states of limbo and purgatory to the state of union with the divine, or paradise. Concerning the ritual or technical side of the magic of the sacred pentagram with 5 wounds, this is to be found outlined in the 3rd letter relating to the arcanum, the Empress. The quaternary united and bound to the decad, of which St. Martin speaks, is therefore the quaternary or pentagram of 5 wounds. The other quaternary, qualified by St. Martin as absolutely evil, is separated from the decad, i.e. from the 5 currents or members of the human will, endowed with 5 wounds from the divine will. The 5 currents of the human will endowed with 5 wounds also correspond to the letters YHSVH of the name Yeshua, Jesus, as is accepted symbolically by Kunrath, Kircher, St. Martin and others, although in Hebrew the name of Jesus is written Yeshua. But I shall not say, as radically as St. Martin does, that the quaternary separated from the decad is absolutely evil. It is rather arbitrary, and it is evil only insofar as the human personality emancipated from the divine and from nature is evil. In any case, the pentagram, other than that of the 5 wounds, is not the sign of black magic, but rather that of arbitrary magic, or grey magic if you wish, because it is the sign of the power of the personality as such, which is inevitably a mixture of good and evil, even when it acts with the best intentions in the world. Oswald Worth says concerning this, "Common magic deceives itself about the power of this sign, which by itself confers no power. The individual will is powerful only in the measure to which it is in harmony with a more general power. Let us not seek to develop the will artificially and to transform ourselves into athletes of the will." Oswald Worth, Les Tarots des Imagiers du Moyen Âge, page 123. Regarding the 2 forms of the pentagram, with the point above and with the point below, they do not in any way correspond to the division of magic into white magic and black magic, although the traditional masters, Eliphas Levi, for example, teach this. You can certainly draw the head of a goat, as Eliphas Levi does, in the reverse pentagram. It does not become through this the sign of black magic. The 2 forms of the pentagram refer to human electricity, i.e. the electricity of the human organism accompanying the movements of the will, of the head and of the legs, which has nothing to do with horns. It is the same electricity in both cases, with the sole difference that in the case of the pentagram with the point turned above, it is the will of the intellect which moves the electrical currents, whilst in the case of the pentagram with the point turned below, it is the intelligence of the will which does so. The 2 poles of the will can equally serve good or evil, although in fact both represent a mixture of the 2 principles. It is true, however, that there is more chance in the case of the sign of the pentagram with the point turned above for reason and conscience to make the best of the operation than in the case of the reverse pentagram, but all depends here on the intellectual and moral state of the operator. A perverse intellectuality could certainly make worse use of the upright pentagram than a sound will motivated by a good intention would of the reverse pentagram. Therefore, let us not be afraid of the reverse pentagram or depend too much on the upright pentagram. But let us return to the quaternary bound and united to the fullness of the decad, i.e. to the sacred pentagram of 5 wounds. Let us consider it now not as an individual affair, but rather as one for the whole of mankind. The history of mankind, seen from its nocturnal side, is at root the operation of a limited number of magical formulae and signs. Whatever you may do, you may place yourself under the aegis of such a formula and sign. The cross, the pentagram, and the hexagram are signs and formulae which operate in the history of mankind. The cross is the vow and virtue of obedience, i.e. the sign and formula of faith, as horizontal human respiration and vertical divine respiration united together. The pentagram is initiative. It is effort and work, i.e. the vow and virtue of poverty, or the sign and formula of hope as the effect of the presence of divine light here below. The hexagram is the vow and virtue of chastity, i.e. the sign and formula of love, as the unity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and Mother, Daughter, and Holy Soul. The spiritual history of mankind is the way from the cross to the pentagram, and from the pentagram to the hexagram, i.e. it is the school of obedience, poverty, and chastity, and it is at the same time the divine magical operation where love is attained through faith by means of hope. The Middle Ages erected the cross above the nations, societies, aspirations and thoughts of Europe. This was the epoch of obedience and faith, accompanied by every imaginable human abuse. This was followed by an epoch where the dawn of hope made itself felt. Humanism, with its flourishing of Renaissance art, philosophy and science, was born under the sign of hope. The sign of the pentagram began its ascent. It was then that opposition arose between the sacred pentagram of 5 wounds and the pentagram of the emancipated personality. A purely humanistic art, science and magic had its development under the sign of the pentagram of hope in man, as opposed to the sign of the pentagram of hope in God, i.e. the sacred pentagram of the 5 wounds, under which latter sign Christian esotericism, Christian-orientated mysticism, gnosis, sacred magic and Hermeticism has its development. The impulse of freedom, of hope in emancipated man, has built up and demolished a great deal. It has created a materialistic civilization without parallel, but at the same time it has destroyed the hierarchical order, the order of spiritual obedience. A series of religious, political and social revolutions has ensued. But the hierarchical order is eternal, and obedience is indispensable. Now, new hierarchical orders are beginning to be established, replacing obedience by tyranny and dictatorship. For he who sows the wind shall reap the whirlwind. Hosea 9:7. This is a truth that we are learning with so much suffering today. The pentagram of hope in emancipated man has in former times sown the wind, and we and our contemporaries are now reaping the whirlwind. Now, the post of Pope in the spiritual history of mankind is that of guardian of the sacred pentagram of the 5 wounds, i.e. he who guards the one legitimate way of passing from the cross to the pentagram and from the pentagram to the hexagram. The function of the spiritual post of Pope is to see to it that it is only after the cross is taken up that the pentagram has its ascent, and that it is only after the sacred pentagram of the 5 wounds is taken up that the raising of the hexagram takes place. The mission of the post of Pope is to take care that spiritual obedience, poverty and chastity, free and holy, do not disappear from the world, and that there are always people in the world who embrace them and represent them. This is why the post of Pope was founded upon the quality of Petrus, Peter. And I tell you, you are Peter, Petrus, and on this rock, Petra, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Matthew 16:18. The 5 gates of hell, the will to greatness, the desire to take and to keep, the desire to advance and to hold on to at the expense of others, being the counter-formula, shall not prevail against the formula of the 5 wounds. And these wounds are the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The divine magical power of these keys is such that whatever is bound by their virtue on earth will be bound in heaven, and that whatever is loosened by their virtue on earth will be loosened in heaven. For that which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above. And when disobedience, greed, and unchastity prevail on the earth of such a kind that there never was before, then it is the virtue of the keys or the sacred wounds which can re-establish the unity of that which is above and that which is below, i.e. to bind and to loosen, by an act which, put into words, would have the tenor of the following: May that which is above be as that which is below, and may that which is below be as that which is above.